I want to show you a few images, not many, of the women's movement at work around the world. As you know, women have made a lot of progress in the last 50 years, right? And women's rights have really advanced across the globe in the last 50 years. And if you think about it, 50 years is a very short time in human history. And that's half of humanity that has really transformed its conditions and the discourse about its conditions. Women are on the move everywhere. They're fighting for the right to control their bodies and their lives, to be free of violence. They're fighting for livelihoods, equality, a voice at the table, power, respect, and that is universal. They're really fighting, in fact, to be considered full subjects of human rights, and that's, of course, something of concern to the Hande Center. And here what you see is the women's movement and its allies in Uruguay in South America in 2002 as they were fighting for the liberalization of the abortion law in Uruguay. And they were successful. And, you can see what it took, but it worked. So let me tell you about progress on a few issues, and I'll choose the issues that we've been working on, but there are others, but those are the ones I know most about. One of the key issues, and one of the most contentious one, is the right to abortion. And it's important to, step back, given the attacks in this country on abortion rights, to look at the context and to realize that since from between 1950 and 1985, nearly all industrialized countries liberalized their abortion laws. There was a huge movement amongst rich nations between 1950 and 1985. There were a few exceptions to that, Ireland being one of them, but by and large there was a huge movement to liberalize abortion laws, including in this country. And then after that, we had the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo in 1994, which was a crucial moment in reproductive rights, where all 179 countries present agreed that they should do something about abortion, amongst other things, reproductive health more generally, but abortion particularly. And since then, 30 countries in the global south have also liberalized their laws. And during that time, of course, there's been a conservative backlash. A relatively small religious right-wing movement that has gained political power, has captured political parties in some places, and has used abortion to develop, to sustain a populist movement. That's what we've seen in this country with the capture of the Republican Party. It's happened in other countries. But still, so far, only a handful of countries have actually gone backwards and restricted their laws. Amongst them, Poland and Hungary, and in Latin America, Nicaragua and El Salvador, where abortion has become completely illegal in all circumstances. And of course, we've seen this movement in the United States at the state level with all kinds of attempts to restrict abortion rights. But if you look at the bigger picture, still there's massive progress. Of course, there are plenty of countries that still have not liberalized their laws, and in those countries, women still die or end up in the emergency room or suffer grave injuries as a result of abortion. And we still have, as a result, an estimated 47,000 women who die every year of unsafe abortion worldwide. These are all absolutely 100% preventable deaths, because abortion, when performed by someone who knows what they're doing, is an extremely safe procedure, vastly safer than childbirth. And so that is something that the women's movement continues to fight for that reason, because these are unnecessary deaths and we should care about them. And I can say more about the consequences of strict laws during question period. But the women's movement is not taking it lying down. So here are the women of Poland fighting back. So the law had already been restricted in the early 1990s. A few weeks ago, there was an attempt by Parliament to present an even more restrictive law that would have banned all abortions except to save the life of the woman. And the women of Poland just snapped, and they just thought, "That's it. We've had enough," and they went on strike, national strike for a whole day. They didn't show up to work. And then they marched in all cities of Poland. And it was something incredible and awesome. And the government, which is not a nice government, backed down. So that's a lesson for us. If we mobilize massively, we can stand our ground, right? The other area where there's been significant improvement is in maternal mortality, which rates of death in pregnancy and childbirth have been cut in half since 1990. So we went from an estimated 532,000 deaths a year in pregnancy and childbirth in 1990 to now an estimated 303,000 estimates, because a lot of women's deaths are actually not registered in many countries, but based on the birth rates and mortality rates, we can tell what the number is. And this is, of course, related to the liberalization of abortion laws, because unsafe abortion is a cause of death in pregnancy, but also it's due to improvement in delivery care, the training of midwives, the provision of emergency obstetric care, for complications at delivery, and of course, with the rise in contraceptives, there's also fewer unintended pregnancies, and if fewer people are pregnant, there are fewer people dying in pregnancy. So that's also a huge and important movement. And here's the improvement in access to contraception. As I just noted, women everywhere have much greater access to contraception. In 2015, worldwide, 64% of all women in a formalized union, a marriage or a union, were using contraception. And of these 64%, 90% were using modern methods, which are effective, right? And if you compare that to 1970, it's double the number, because in 1970 it was only 36% of all women worldwide using contraception, and at the time most of them were in North America and in Europe. And so there's been a lot of progress in the rest of the world, and in particular in South and Central America and in East Asia, Japan, South Korea, and China. Massive gains there in contraceptive use, but there's still a lot of regional variations, and we still have a lot to do to provide women with access to contraceptives, because, for example, in Africa, we still only have 33% of women using modern contraception, and in some countries it's much lower. For example, in Nigeria, where we work, and we find women's groups in Nigeria, only 16% of women there have access to contraception. So big regional disparities, but overall, great progress, and of course, the change, when it happens, can be very rapid. Eastern Asia, for example, flipped very quickly. Like within 20 years, it went from very low rates to very high rates of use. Then there's violence against women. If you think about 40 years ago, violence against women was not a subject that was even discussed by academics or by the UN or by human rights defenders and human rights lawyers. It is now understood as a major violation of women's rights, but at that time it was not. It was considered a private matter and not a subject for human rights investigation. So that's been a tremendous change. Again, the women's movement has really driven this, by really insisting that violence against women be recognized as a violation and be called out for what it is. And also the women's movement has really pushed investigators to collect data on the prevalence of violence against women, domestic violence. And that's how we now know that 1/3 of women globally have experienced physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner, because we conducted studies, academics and the UN system have conducted studies that have gathered this data from hundreds of sites, and over 129 countries now report on this. So now we have the data, so we actually know how big a problem it is, and we're also increasing our understanding of what interventions work to prevent violence against women. There's more needed there, more research is needed, but we're starting to understand some of the key factors to prevent it, notably stopping violence in childhood, and developing the parenting skills of young parents, so that the cycle of violence is stopped in childhood, because if you've been exposed to violence in childhood, you've yourself been violated or attacked or beaten or have witnessed violence in your home, you're more likely to perpetrate or be a victim of violence as an adult. And also, we need to change gender norms, because violence against women and patriarchy go together, right? They're a part of the same system, and therefore you need to do sexuality education and gender education. So those things we know, which we didn't know before. And then there's political participation of women. It's slowly increasing. It's really slow, but it's increasing. Women made up 11% of national parliaments in 1995. Now they make 23% of national parliaments worldwide. And Rwanda, here they are, is the champion with 63% of the parliamentarians women. And the US has a lot of work to do because we're still barely at 20% in Congress. So we have a way to go, as we could tell from the last election. So that's some of the progress in country, but there's also been tremendous progress at the global level. And we at the Coalition do a lot of work advocating for women's rights, including sexual and reproductive health and rights at the global level. We're based in New York, so we engage with the United Nations and we lobby governments there. So we spend a lot of time in the halls and the basement of the UN. And we do this with coalitions of women's groups from all over the world, because obviously I'm not the right person to go and lobby the government of Pakistan, but we have colleagues from Pakistan who will come for specific negotiations and can pressure their own governments and know them often from country level. And so we come with large coalitions and pressure them. And there's been a lot of progress in the recognition of women's rights at the global level since the Beijing Conference on Women, and ever since. We've been there the whole time, the women's movement, and have continued to move the agenda forward. Not always easy, and it was very hard during the Bush administration, but the progress has continued. And we're very proud of what all governments agreed to last year in September, which is the new global development agenda epitomized in the Sustainable Development Goals. These are a set of 17 goals that were approved by 193 governments to tackle poverty, to tackle climate change and environmental justice, as well as social and economic justice. So as you see, it covers topics like health, education, sanitation, hunger, poverty, but also sustainable cities, consumption and production, decent work, oceans, forests, climate change, peace and security, and so on. Very comprehensive agenda. It took 3 years to negotiate. The women's movement organized and was there every week for 3 years. It was an incredible labor, but it was worth it because this applies to all governments, including the US government. All governments have agreed that they will take measures to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a 15-year agenda, so it will take us to the year 2030, and it will direct a lot of investment. You know, the World Bank, the major donors, national policymakers, national budgets. That is the hope, anyway, and that's why we got involved with it. And we're very proud, in particular, of Goal 5, which you see here, gender equality, which states explicitly that one of the key drivers of all this will be to make sure that women's rights and gender equality are achieved. And that wasn't a given at the start. You know, at the start they wanted to have a much narrower focus on energy and transportation and so on, the serious stuff, right? And we said, no, women's rights has to be part of that. And we prevailed. And it's also a much better agenda than we've ever had in that kind of negotiation because it's a comprehensive agenda. And it's much improved in that respect from the Millennium Development Goals, which also had the previous set of global goals, which had a gender goal, but which was much more limited to primary school education and violence against women in a very limited way. So this, if you look at it now, these are only some of the targets under Goal 5. This is not even the whole thing. But there's a target on eliminating all forms of violence against women and girls in public and private, including trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation. There's a target on harmful practices such as child early and forced marriage and female genital mutilation. There's a target on recognizing the value of women's unpaid care and domestic work. Can you imagine how hard that was to get in there? Through the provision of public services, infrastructure, and social protection policies, like child care support, maternity leave, and all that. And of course, the promotion of shared responsibility in the household and the family. Then ensuring women's full and effective participation in equal opportunities for leadership at all levels, in political, economic, and public life. Again, a very robust agenda there. And finally, the one that was the hardest fought, you can imagine, sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights. And so we got that in there, which is, if you think about it, pretty astonishing. So that's the progress we've been able to make at the global level. And of course, none of that would have been possible without the women's movement. Here we are in one of the many negotiations after we got some of what we wanted. And you see the diplomats in front. And us in the back. But we were in the room, and we were there day and night. Now, the context for where we are now and where we're going in the US. Let me say a few words about the United States at the global level under President Obama. Yes, as we're looking at this photo, we're all signed. The US administration under Obama was supportive of reproductive rights, of course domestically, but also globally. They played a leadership role in the negotiation of the Sustainable Development Goals, and that was extremely important. The US plays a crucial role in multilateral diplomacy. You know, we can do without them if we have to, but it's a lot easier when the US is really driving the human rights agenda. It's not always been easy. They've been cautious. You know, there are times when we wanted them to be bolder and take more leadership, for example, on sexual rights. It took them 7 years, and we had to drag them kicking and screaming through that threshold, but they eventually started using the phrase sexual rights in negotiations, which was a huge step forward, given, you know, that we had same-sex marriage and now constitutional rights in this right in this country. But they eventually got there. They also, the Obama administration did a lot to create what we called a gender architecture, embedding institutions in the State Department and in the White House that look specifically at women and girls. There's the Office of Global Women's Issues at the State Department now. Hopefully it will survive, we'll see. And the White House Council on Women and Girls, obviously in the White House. And in the State Department is also an ambassador at large for women and girls, Kathy Russell, who's been incredibly dynamic and very helpful. We also have had a lot of leadership from the State Department on agreeing to a whole of government strategy on empowering adolescent girls. That's now part of the US foreign policy, a strategy to empower adolescent girls, which is incredible because usually, you know, foreign policy is, you know, it's the hard stuff, nuclear disarmament and this and that. And adolescent girls, you know, it took a lot of work on these diplomats and these foreign policy officers to get them to see that this was actually crucial to the well-being of the world and really underpinned the Sustainable Development Goal on gender equality. But they did it, and they brought together all the agencies, USAID, PEPFAR, the agency dealing with HIV, the State Department, the Peace Corps, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, so everyone got on the same page and agreed to this common strategy. In terms of overseas development assistance, the US during that time, while it's never been even close to 0.7% of GDP, which is the, you know, the globally agreed target, the US is not even close to that. It's still, in absolute terms, because of the size of our economy, the biggest donor to women's causes. And it's, in the US, it's been especially important when it comes to reproductive rights, family planning, and HIV. So they've not always been bold, but they've been solid. They could have done more. I'm sure they regret some of what they didn't do now, but they were nevertheless, you know, an administration we could work with deeply, and we did work with deeply. Now, sorry, trigger word. I should have triggered word. What can we expect from a Trump administration? Well, Trump himself has no policy record of any kind, right? But on women, he is on the record as admitting that he's committed sexual assault, to start with. And he's also belittled and demeaned women publicly, and has said women should be punished for abortion and should go to another state if abortion is no longer available in the state where they reside. So that's, you know, some of the things he said. On the global front, he has no foreign policy experience and is not a fan of the UN or of multilateralism. And he's not particularly interested in other countries except to build hotels and golf courses and make deals. And he actually brags that he spent only 3 hours in Slovenia, the country of origin of his wife. So he has not much, as we've seen lately with his phone calls to heads of state, he doesn't have much respect for diplomacy and certainly doesn't seem to have much interest for protocol and previous agreements. So that's a lot of uncertainty in a president. But the person we're more worried about is this man, Mike Pence, the VP-elect, who has a dismal policy record on women's rights and women's health. And we expect him to play a critical role. He is already at work, and he is himself as a very conservative Catholic. He has a policy record because he served in the House of Representatives between 2001 and 2013, and then after that as governor of Indiana until now. And during that time, he's been a vocal proponent of anti-women legislation and anti-women executive action. In Congress, he attempted to have the House Republicans reinstate the global gag rule, which prevents foreign agencies that receive USAID funding for family planning to speak about abortion. That's why it's called the global gag rule. They tried to reinstate it legislatively in 2011. Of course, they couldn't do it because President Obama vetoed that, but he led the charge on that. He also led the charge to defund Planned Parenthood. That's been one of his signature moves. In Indiana, he's the man who brought us forcible rape. Do you remember forcible rape? He co-sponsored legislation that would have restricted abortion only in cases of forcible rape, meaning it should be someone you don't know, you're a stranger who grabs you on the street, because anybody else, you probably are consenting, right? Your husband, your boyfriend, your partner, the person you're dating. He also encouraged the Attorney General of Indiana to prosecute Purvi Patel in Indiana. She's a woman who stated that she had miscarried. When she showed up in the emergency room, she was instead accused of having self-induced an abortion and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. This is in Indiana. The Court of Appeals, however, of Indiana overturned, and that district overturned the verdict, but it took a huge legal battle to free Purvi Patel. In Indiana, he cut funding for Planned Parenthood and forced the closure of happy clinics there in the state of Indiana. He also signed into law a bill that would have forced women to bury fetal tissue after a miscarriage or an abortion. He refused to allow needle exchange when there was a spike in HIV infection in Indiana as a result of an increase in heroin use. And this led to the largest outbreak of HIV recorded in the US for 20 years. It forced the Centers for Disease Control to intervene and insist that he provide clean needles. He's a proponent of abstinence-only education as part of HIV funding here and abroad. And he's also signed into law the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which would have allowed businesses to refuse to serve gay patrons. He finally supports conversion therapy for LGBT, including electroshock therapy. He's also anti-immigration, etc. That's Mike Pence. And he's on the record on all these issues. So we're taking it seriously. We're taking him very, very seriously. We're not giving him the benefit of the doubt, and we're not waiting to see what he's going to do. We know what he's going to do, and he's already at work. Then at the UN, we have Nikki Haley. She's the governor of South Carolina. She's been the governor since 2011. She has no foreign policy experience. Her entire career has been spent in South Carolina. But apart from the fact that she gained some notoriety for removing the Confederate flag that was flying in front of the Capitol in South Carolina, she's very conservative. She's conservative on women's rights. She's very anti-abortion. She says she's anti-abortion because her husband was adopted. So that's why she's against it. She's anti-gay marriage. She's also anti-immigration, even though she is the daughter of Indian immigrants. She would require immigrants to carry identification at all times. She would require employers to demonstrate that their employees actually are legal residents. She's asked the federal government to stop resettling Syrians in South Carolina, etc. She's also opposed a federal directive allowing students to use the bathroom of their chosen gender identity. And she has not expanded Medicaid under Obamacare, leaving $13 billion on the table that could have been used to serve the poor in South Carolina. Schools in South Carolina still teach abstinence only until marriage, and not surprisingly, there's very high rates of teenage pregnancy in South Carolina. So I'm looking forward to seeing her face-to-face with the Russian ambassador to the UN, Vitaly Churkin, who is very experienced. He's an old fox, who's been the UN ambassador since 2006, who speaks fluent Russian, English, French, and Mongolian. Or I'd like to see her with Liu Ji, the Chinese ambassador, who has 21 years of experience in the global arena. I think she's going to be eaten alive, but we'll see. And at the global level, we expect, of course, a complete change in posture on reproductive rights, sexual rights, women's rights, violence against women, and HIV. We saw this before in the Bush era, where and I was around for that. The Bush administration brought delegations representing the U.S. government to the UN that were full of conservative right-wingers who sought to overturn international agreements on reproductive rights. These were people who would stand up and say that the U.S. was supportive of natural family planning methods, that the U.S. Policy was that life begins at conception. I've heard this numerous times. Of course, who denounced any mention of sexual orientation, gender identity, promoted abstinence only, the traditional family, heterosexual family, and of course motherhood as the main objective for women's lives. So we can expect a return to that, and I expect it to be worse actually, given that we have much more extreme individuals in the cabinet, as you saw, and also that they'll go faster and harder because they've done it once before in the Bush era, so they know what to do now, and I think they're going to go for it. So it is going to be brutal. In development assistance, we expect, we've talked to our colleagues who are contracting agencies of USAID on reproductive health and women's rights, and they expect serious cuts in foreign assistance to family planning and HIV. The President Trump's budget could be a zero budget on that. You submit a budget that says we want no money for USAID on these issues. Then, of course, it's up to Congress to rebuild the budget, but given that Congress is in the hands of Republicans, I'm not sure what's going to come out of that. And we could see a return to the use of faith-based organizations as the main vehicle for delivering foreign assistance. So what are we going to do? Sorry to have, that's why I energize you first. Let's re-energize now. We're going to mobilize and we're going to fight. And we are going to organize because we have to, right? So what we're going to do, we're going to turn to Congress. Since the administration is not going to be very helpful, we're going to fight by turning to our allies, existing allies and new allies in Congress. We have already, at the coalition, we have two people in Washington, D.C. They work extensively on the Hill and with the administration. When you can't work with the administration, you pivot to the Hill. And we have deep relationships with several congressional offices, and we're going to continue to build them and develop them and also cultivate new ones. So we hope to forge new alliances with the new offices. We have Mahdi Hassan of New Hampshire in the Senate. We have Kamala Harris, thank you, California. We have Tammy Duckworth from Illinois, and of course we have existing offices such as Kirsten Gillibrand of New York. As you know, Republicans don't have the 60 votes in the Senate that they need to ram everything through. At least for now, they have to use, there's still the rule that you have 60, you need 60 votes. This will be important for certain, high-level judicial confirmations, for changing certain laws. So we're gonna work hard with the Senate. It is one of our few bulwarks. But we're also gonna work with the House, because the House is still useful for investigations and hearings. It's useful for review of bills and committees, for budgetary decisions and appropriations. So it won't, the Republicans have the majority, but we can make a lot of trouble for them. and we will. So there we have, allies like Betty McCollum from Minnesota, Jan Schakowsky of Illinois, Louise Slaughter of New York, Diana DeGetti, who is a new face from Colorado, and Jamie Raskin, a new face from Maryland. So and a lot of them have indicated already they want to meet, they want to fight, they want to know what we're thinking, they need a briefing, so we're already at work. At the global level, we have deep connections with other governments. As I told you, we lobby governments directly with the women's movement, and so we have connections to other governments which are still progressive. I mean, there's some of them here, and are still very supportive of women's rights. So we need to use them to block the U.S. and also we're going to use the platforms that the UN gives us to name and shame the United States. Of course, it's a more difficult context right now than it was in 2000 when Bush came in power, but it's not impossible. So we're going to do it. And of course, the U.S. may help us, the Trump administration may help us if they could well offend a lot of people at the UN if they become overbearing and throw their weight around, which is already starting. And when the U.S. does that, it doesn't. It's not well received generally at the UN. So hopefully, we can. If Trump is Trump, we should have additional emotional capital to work with. And then we're going to work with the rest of the women's movement across borders. Here with some of our colleagues from Jamaica, and there's me. And this is one of our colleagues from Sri Lanka and one from Pakistan. And we at the Coalition Fund these organizations in country. We have been a grant maker for 32 years. So we support them to do that work at country level, but also to come to key UN negotiations to lobby, as I indicated. And this global solidarity across the women's movement, across the human rights movement, across the environmental movement is going to be essential. It's going to be essential in the next 4 years, or hopefully not longer. It's going to be certainly essential to name and shame and block the worst initiatives of the administration, but also to move forward on implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals and other agreements on human rights, women's rights, climate change, peace and security, whatever you needed. And so we're going to work closely with the rest of the women's movement, and that's why I've been telling donors we need to support the women's movement right now and other progressive movements, because we're going to be fighting, and we need right now flexible long-term support in order to do this. This is going to be key. So we're counting on that asset that we have, the global solidarity, which is fantastic. So I'll leave it at that for now. Open it up to questions from Jesse and from you. Thank you.
So I just wanted to start with a couple of questions. The first one being, I'm going to go back to the negative for a second. I'll try to end with a positive question. What kind of chilling effect can we potentially anticipate on the global scene in terms of women's representation in government? You mentioned there has been great momentum on this issue, and Rwanda is always cited as this great exemplar. But in part, I think Rwanda has done that to sort of appease the international community, as Paul Kagame sort of cements his place and looks for economic investment. I think part of his motivation has been to say, hey, look what a great job we're doing. That's not to diminish what they have done, but obviously, but a lot of us anticipated a female UN Secretary General, and as it turns out, I think not only did it not happen, but the likelihood that it was going to happen, I think, was a lot less than maybe we anticipated now that sort of details of the negotiations have come out, and then obviously the result of the elections here in the U.S. having broad international effects. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you see that playing out.
Yeah, whether or not it will discourage women in particular from stepping forward and running for office, that's a good question. I don't have a crystal ball. I have to say that on the UN Secretary General question, we did some advocacy on having a woman Secretary General, and especially a feminist, because we didn't want just any kind of woman, but we wanted a feminist, someone who held the whole agenda of women's rights and wasn't going to shy away from supporting women's rights. You know, often what you get is a powerful woman who's risen there and doesn't want to be associated with gender equality. So and the candidates that were coming forward were actually really good. And you're right, we heard then that, in fact, there was active negotiation not to have a woman, and in the straw polls that took place in the General Assembly, as a result, the women candidates who were extremely qualified never made it to the top 3 in any of the straw polls. So we have a long way to go. Yeah. And it could be seen as discouraging by some, the next time around, other candidates. But the one good thing I would say about that is that we saw the breadth of qualified women, the depth and the breadth. We had 7 highly qualified candidates, the head of UNESCO, the head of UNDP, former foreign ministers, former prime ministers of their countries running for Secretary General. So I think it's put to rest at least the notion that there are no qualified women, just can't find any, where are those binders full of women? So that part is like, the other thing that it did though is, I think as a result, they elected a much better male candidate than they would normally have, because that process tends to lead to mediocrity, sorry to say, but, or least offensive to, and because they had the 7 qualified women, they couldn't just put in anybody. So Guterres is actually very good. I mean, he's actually a solid incoming Secretary General. But what we've done now is put him on notice that we want him to be a feminist. And he's got a mixed record, right? When he was Prime Minister of Portugal, he actually blocked the legalization of abortion. It happened after he left office. It was his own party, the Socialist Party, that actually pushed it through. But he blocked it while he was Prime Minister. He's since come around on other issues that he was against when he was Prime Minister, like same-sex marriage. And he's obviously not a doctrinaire because he did preside over the liberalization of drug laws in Portugal when he was the Prime Minister. So he's an interesting character. I'm meeting with him in a week and a half. I'm a one-on-one with him. So I'm going to ask him about his posture on abortion, and that we need him to be a feminist and hold the entire agenda in the Sustainable Development Goals, which includes reproductive rights. So we'll see what he says. But yeah, I mean, and the same with the election, the attacks, and it's so difficult for women to make it through and not be judged by their gender. But at the same time, yeah. I think we're not going to stop. I think the movement for women's political participation is not going to stop. Yeah. And to your point about Rwanda, true that Kagame may be gender washing, using gender to sort of, hide some of his killing of his opponents and repression. Definitely a concern. But at the same time, the women's movement in Rwanda is pretty amazing, and the widows movement in Rwanda after the genocide has been a formidable force and a real force. It's not manipulated by, I wouldn't say that Kagame controls that. So, yeah.
Let's ask one more question and then I'll leave it. Quick question about sort of changing narratives. Obviously, a lot of your work is about supporting civil society organizations in the many countries where you work, obviously providing them advocacy tools and as well as very practical tools for how to operate.
And funding.
And funding, of course. Right. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit, maybe give us a great success story to bring hope back about how you've worked to actually sort of change perceptions and narratives, because I think for a lot of that work to really be impactful in terms of sort of international development work, they need to be working in an environment where those rights are going to be respected, right? Like when we were chatting before this, we were talking about Egypt and one of the partners there, and sort of how they're really facing repression at the government level. And so it's hard not to feel like you're just like ramming your head against the wall, giving people tools, but then the government's going to keep wearing them down. So I'm wondering if you can give maybe a success story of a case where you've really worked with government to sort of change perceptions around women's rights or women's empowerment to really enable that civil society movement to take hold.
Right. There are many examples. I'm trying to think of the one that would be most. I think the whole movement to end child marriage is, I think, an interesting one that really came out of the women's movement, and we at the coalition were one of the early organizations working on that issue in the mid-2000s, before everybody came on board. You know, now it's a big issue and girls not brides and everybody's on board, right? But when we started working on that in the mid-2000s, it was not understood as a problem, again, as a human rights violation, as a form of violence against girls. And what we did, we started working at the country level with groups that were identifying this problem in their own community, women's groups. And in northern Cameroon, you know, the part of Cameroon that abuts into Chad and the part of Nigeria where Boko Haram is operating, that part of Cameroon, a very conservative and poor part of the country, there were women's groups that we knew, because we circulate. And they were working on this issue because they saw it as the main impediment to women's equality. Because if a girl's married off at 13 and starts having children, so is pulled out of school, the rest of her life is of course not going to turn out the way it could and should. And so, based on that, on the ground, you know, discussion and the understanding of what they were identifying as the problem, we took this to Washington, D.C. and to the UN and started speaking about it and saying, okay, we have some, and in fact there's some agreements, you know, the international human rights agreements have said for a long time that you shouldn't enter marriage through force, right? That's a long-standing norm, but it was never really applied in practice. What does this mean in the lives of women and girls? And how are we going to fight it? So we started to mobilize at the global level in Washington, D.C., and then started supporting the women's groups who are doing that work. And they showed us the way, you know, that community conversations, identifying the root cause of these marriages, and how we're going to persuade decision makers, which are the fathers and the male leaders in the community, to change their behavior, to not send their girls off to marriage. And you know, and that's where also we learned from them early on, before we had the evidence, that they didn't see this as a problem of poverty. Because often the narrative is, you know, child marriage is because the families are poor. They said to us, no. Because we see wealthy families marrying off their girls, and often more than poor families, because actually they have more money to, you know, it's more advantageous to the two families to make a deal with the girl as the sort of the product, right? What we see is that it's a question of the status of girls, the low status of girls in our community. Okay, so that even, you know, defied our, you know, the received wisdom at the global level and that the development community helped. And from there, you know, some research was conducted by other organizations. It confirmed that it is gender inequality that is at the root of child marriage. And then, you know, the campaigns began and so on. And now we are, you know, much later in a space where there is, you know, an African Union movement to end child marriage, with governments signing on now to, you know, adopt the laws and then implement the measures and, you know, send the message that girls need to be kept in school, provide the financial support to the family so they can keep girls in school, etc., provide programs for girls that teach them literacy. So it's starting to happen in a way that, you know, you couldn't have imagined when we started, but it took a long time. I mean, that's a 15-year saga, right? So, yeah, so we're hopeful. It's possible to do it. You just have to work with people on the ground closely, listen to them, really work in partnership, and stay the course.
Thank you. I know I